Yeah, thanks, Mark. Well, good afternoon to everybody. I was very interested to see that the conference was going to be based around the Protection of Wrecks Act this year, but then gave a second thought that as the predominant number of the protected sites are sprinkled liberally around the south coast, I was very pleased to see that the first talk this afternoon uh, from Colin Martin was a brilliant talk from a Scottish wreck site, and I see later on this afternoon we have somebody talking about one of the Northern Ireland sites. So it falls on me to talk for the rest of this presentation about the sites in Wales. For those of you that are perhaps logging in from outside of the UK or aren't familiar with the islands here, on the screen there is a map of the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland. And this is the bit that is actually Wales that's highlighted there. I hope you can all see that. So what has Wales got to offer on the maritime front? Well, it's got quite a long coastline. It's got 2,700 kilometres of coastline. So there's plenty of scope for a lot of shipwrecks around the Welsh coast. The Welsh Assembly, under the guise of Cadw, who is their heritage agency, also looks after 32,000 square kilometres of seabed. And in amongst all that, they have on the National Monuments Record for Wales, we have in excess of 8,000 maritime sites and entries. They include a whole gambit of sites, and you can see from the list there, they're quite varied. And considering that there's over 5,500 shipwrecks, only 6 of them are actually designated under the Protection of Wrecks Act. Of the 6, it's not going to take me long to quickly run through those. So the oldest of those is a Viking site, thought to be potentially around the 11th century. It's out on the Smalls. The Smalls is a rocky outcrop off of Pembroke. It's about 17 miles offshore, and it's just a group of rocks with a lighthouse above it. And the single find that has been found on that site is a Viking sword guard. And so it's really just a find spot as opposed to a Viking site. And certainly no remains of any Viking vessel has been found on that site. The second oldest site in Wales that's protected is a 16th century slate wreck. It doesn't have the name for it, but it is in the Menai Straits. It's just south of the 2 bridges across the straits, joining the mainland to Anglesey. And it's known as the Pertinent wrecks after a small habitation of a cluster of houses on the north bank of the Menai Straits. The ferry that used to run across ended there before the bridges were built. And it's a slate wreck because on the wreck itself are in excess of 40,000, around 20 tons of slates. The date is thought to be 16th century from the timbers. There have been some of the timber which has been analysed, but it's certainly a pre-industrial slate site because the slates themselves are shown to have not been cut using mechanical methods or even just a broad chisel. They've actually been gouged out. So that's the second site. The third one actually has a name. So here we are off the Skerries, off of Anglesey. It's about 2 miles offshore. And again, it's just a cluster of rocks with a lighthouse on top. It's about 2 miles off. The wreck itself is the Royal Yacht, and there's a picture of it there, a model of it. It was built by the Dutch East India Company for Charles II after the restoration of the monarchy after 11 years of civil war, when the country was basically a republic. It's a luxury yacht, and it's wrecked out there. So that is in fact, that was the 5th site designated under the Act, 1 year after the Act came into force. The next site is in Cardigan Bay. It lies halfway between Barmouth and Harlech, and it's only about 400 meters off the coast. The name of this wreck remains a mystery to even today. So again, it's colloquially known as the Talibont site after the nearest village on land. It's sometimes known as the Bronze Bell site, as a bronze bell was recovered from the site, which dated 1677. And that is currently in a museum in Barmouth, along with a lot of the artifacts from the site. So the museum is dedicated particularly to this wreck site. Also on the site is a lot of cannons and anchors, but the main item of interest is the cargo, which is a large group of Italian marble blocks. The date for this site comes from a single piece of information. It comes from, you'll see this Cambrian crossing pilot, which was put together in the 1740s. And there's a small note on that chart, which says, here the wreck of a Genoese ship of about 700 tons lies, lost in 1709, laden with marble, paper, etc. So that's the date that we've come up with for that particular wreck. The final site that I'm going to come on to before I talk in more detail about the mystery wreck is the Resurgam. I think probably most people will have seen or know a little bit about the Resurgam. It lies just off the north coast of Wales in Liverpool Bay. It's about 6 miles off of Rhyl, and it's a steam-powered submarine. It was lost under tow in 1880, and today the wreck is surrounded on 3 sides by wind farms, so it's fairly busy out there in Liverpool Bay. It's a very small submarine, very small wreck. In fact, if you dive it, it's in very shallow water. We're looking at about 12 meters of water, and in a single dive, you can normally circumnavigate it for 2 or 3 times to get a good view and look at it. On a good dive, a good day when it's covered in anemones, it's absolutely fantastic down there. And the final of the 6 wreck sites that are protected under the Act off the Welsh coast is one which has been misnamed. It's been originally named as the Diamond, and it lies on the north side of the Llanbadrig Reef, and it's a large wooden sailing vessel. It's actually quite close to the Talibont site. It's not far away from it. And the image that hopefully you can see there, the black and white image, is one I took a few years ago now. The vertical items that are upstanding there aren't the main frames. They're actually iron knee riders, the mains of it. And just to the right of it, you can probably see on the seabed the remains of the outer planking and the sheathing. The main wooden frames would have lain between the two. So this is the site I want to talk about for the rest of this presentation, because there's for a lot of years now, it's been completely misnamed, and I want to try and see if we can come up with some identification of what it might be. So the Llanbadrig Reef, sometimes known as St. Patrick's Causeway, because it stretches out from the beach for about 12.5 miles, with sections that dry, particularly at low spring tides. I think you can probably visualize that in the 19th century, the predominantly sailing vessels that were out there would have been making their way from the Atlantic up the Irish Sea and round into Liverpool Bay. And they could easily, particularly with bad weather and storms, which predominantly migrate from the southwest to the northeast across the country, could easily be driven into this hook of land at the top end of Cardigan Bay, only to finish up on the Llanbadrig Reef there. So there's a lot of wrecks in that area. And from this map, you can see just a selection of some of the wrecks out there. You can probably see St. Patrick's Causeway marked there. This is taken from Shipwrecks of North Wales from Ivor Wynne-Jones, and it only represents about 30% of the vessels known to have wrecked in the area. I mentioned right at the beginning that Wales has about 5,500 shipwrecks around its coast, but about 10% of them are in this particular area in the top end of Cardigan Bay. So what do we know about this particular site? Well, it was first discovered in 2000 by a couple of local divers. It shows the remains of a large wooden, probably commercial sailing vessel, and it lies about just under 2.5 miles offshore in about 6 to 10 meters of water, depending on the state of the tide. The remains are fairly buried, but they're intact, so they imitate what you'd expect to see from a shipwreck, that sort of lozenge shape of vessel, and they sit upright on the seabed. So initial thoughts were the wreck was a fully rigged merchant vessel known as the Diamond, and that was built in 1823 and wrecked on the reef in 1825, en route from New York to Liverpool, carrying cotton amongst other things. Inspection of the site shows that the vessel's mainframe timbers had been seriously reinforced with iron knee riders. If this was the case of it being the diamond, this 1823 would have represented one of the earliest examples of composite vessel ever built. So with this in mind, in 2002, CADU designated the site, making it only the 6th site to be designated under the Protection of Wrecks Act off the Welsh coast. So following designation, we were asked by CADU to carry out some further investigations in an attempt to authenticate the identity of the vessel as being the diamond or not. The image you can hopefully see there in the foreground is one of the iron knee riders, but in the background you can see the remains of one of two rather large iron tanks. They've now completely disintegrated, but when we took this picture, you can clearly see they were pretty intact, and we think that these are probably potable water tanks. Anyway, for the next 7 years after the designation of the site, we were granted various licenses by CADU to periodically dive the site and to carry out various underwater activities. Over the course of the 7 years, we carried out some survey work on our own. We also carried it out with Wessex Archaeology on a couple of occasions, and we recorded between us many of the site features. We also carried out some limited targeted excavation to recover samples of timber for species identification and dendro, together with some sheathing samples for metallurgical analysis. Between dives, we carried out research into any historical information we could find relating to the diamond. And by the end of 2009, after 7 years of work on this on and off, we were able to compare our underwater findings with the research and concluded that the wreck on the site was almost certainly not that of the diamond. You can see there from the picture, one of Wessex Archaeology's photos, the iron knee rider on the right and the outer sheathing and planking on the left, and they're connected with a large fastening. These are actually Cooper's fastenings stamped Muntspat, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Anyway, having concluded that this site is almost definitely not the diamond, since then the site's affectionately but unofficially been referred to as the NTD, or the Not the Diamond site, really in lieu of the real name being put there. So the reasoning behind our conclusions are really as follows. This is a graph that we have plotted of 19th century sailing vessels, length versus tonnage. And you can see each of those dots is taken from Wooden Ships and Iron Men by Wallace. And you can see we've produced a trend line basically through that. Now, taking the diamond, we knew quite a lot about it. We knew that it was just under 40 meters long and just under 500 tons in weight. And that plots just below the trend line there. However, one of the first exercises that we did on the site was to produce a taped overall length of the remains on the site, bearing in mind that we're working right close to the turn of the bilge. So the overall length that we were likely to record was obviously probably going to be a lot shorter than the original length of the vessel. Anyway, the figure we came up with was 49 meters. So the vessel was probably going to be something between 50 and 60 meters long. And looking at the trend line on the chart there, you can see that that would have given us a registered tonnage of something close to around about 1,000 tons, which is twice the tonnage that the diamond was. So this was a first pointer that the wreck on this site was probably not the diamond. And we started then to compare other details from our underwater investigations with our research into the diamond. And we came up with a whole host of information. The iron reinforcements are obviously there on site, but none are recorded in the details about the diamond or about the iron tanks. The timbers, the species identification that we came up with through Nigel Nailing in Lampeter was that the oak frames were there, but we also had planking of elm, larch and pine, whereas the diamond we know was built with oak and locust. The provenance of the oak was from around the Great Lakes in North America, so that could have been used either in Canada or the US. But one of the things that did come out of it was that the dendrochronology showed that the felling date for the mainframes on our site, on the designated site, were later than 1840, whereas the diamond was built in 1823 and lost 18 months later in 25. The site we know is just under 2.5 miles offshore, but the diamond was reported of having wrecked about a mile from land, from accounts from the time. And regarding the sheathing and the fastenings, we've got both Muntz metal sheathing and Muntz metal fastenings on the site, whereas the diamond was sheathed in pure copper, Muntz metal being only 60% copper, 40% zinc roughly, and no recordings of the diamond's fastenings have been found. So above all, in addition to the difference in tonnage that we see between the site and the diamond, the kicker is obviously the felling date for the timbers. So even when the diamond was lost, not only were the main timbers on the site still growing, they weren't cut down for at least another 15 years. So by 2009, our task would appear to have been completed for Cadu. We'd confirmed that the vessel on the protected site was almost certainly not that of the diamond, and we duly produced an interim report on the site. However, this conclusion isn't the end of the matter, obviously, as immediately it throws up two further questions. If it's not the diamond, what the hell have we been diving on for 7 years? And where is the diamond? So in an attempt to answer these questions, we started to produce a database of all the known maritime incidents that had occurred in this area, from which we hope that we'd be able to help answer these questions. And you can see we finished up at back in 2009 with about 6 pages of database information. Each single line is one vessel. And we finished up with 450 vessels, or just over. But unfortunately, at the time, we had neither the resources to investigate it in any more details. The following year, 2010, Wessex Archaeology were commissioned by Cadu to conduct a series of maritime geophys surveys around the coast of Wales, including a complete sweep over the entire length of the Llanbadrig Reef. And they duly produced a report on their findings. This is a chart of showing the reef from their report. The red outline shows the length and size of the reef itself. And on that reef, they came across 86 anomalies that were identified, of which only 6 were considered to possibly be shipwrecks. And you can see each of the blue dots within that red framework are the anomalies, and the 6 red ones are the shipwrecks, including the designated site, previously known as the diamond. And here's one of the side scans of that site, of the protected site, and you can see our 49-meter length pretty much tallies with the scale on that scan, 50-meter scan, and you can see it is lying upright on the seabed in the shape as you'd expect to see, a classic shape of the lozenge of a shipwreck. So we know that the designated site was just 2.5 miles offshore. However, the contemporary accounts from the period show that it was about a mile off land. So maybe the diamond, if it's not on that site, maybe it's one of the 2 that are a lot closer to the beach. And of the 2 that are there, 7177 and 7176, the first one there, 7177, is about 0.7 of a mile offshore. The other one is even closer inland. So the suggestion is, the hypothesis that we're throwing up here is that this is potentially where the diamond went ashore. And you can see, looking at the side scan image that Wessex produced of that particular site, you can see it is a lot smaller. It is about just under 40 meters, which is the length that the diamond was. Now, during our initial researches, we were advised that a painting existed of the diamond sitting wrecked but upright on the seabed, with its mast clearly visible above the water and about a mile offshore, and that this painting used to hang in a local rectory quite close to the wreck. We have unfortunately been completely unable to locate the current whereabouts of this painting. And if anybody at any time comes across this painting, we would dearly love to see it, because it will go hopefully quite a long way to confirming this hypothesis. because although the painting is almost certainly going to have artistic interpretation, it will be obviously whether it's bow in to coast, stern in, across the tide, whether its orientation is in a particular direction, and then compare it with all these wreck sites. So one of the other things that Wessex Archaeology did in their survey was they recorded the magnetic signatures associated with each of the anomalies. And of the 86 anomalies on the reef, only 35 recorded a reading, of which the Not the Diamond site was one, and it registered the highest magnetic reading of any of the sites on that reef, which is indicative of the amount of iron that we know is on the particular site. By comparison, the site that we think might be the diamond, 7177, produced no magnetic response at all, which is more likely to be from a wooden ship containing little or no iron, like the diamond. So here we have a hypothesis of where the diamond might be. But what about the vessel that is actually on the designated site? If it's not the diamond, what is it? Well, if we move forward to 2020, I think everybody in the audience will know what happened. COVID struck. And those of you that attended the online NAS conference that year may have remembered me talking about a project that we set up for people in lockdown to try and help them survive. The project was called the Welsh Wreck Web Research Project, which is pretty difficult to say. Apologise for that. And what we did was threw out there copies of our database that we had with a best part of 450 wrecks known to have had incidents in the area, and see if people would like to carry out any online investigations into it. Now, I don't intend to talk about this again in any detail, except to say that by the end of the exercise, which we ran for 12 months, 275 reports had been completed by an amazing group of volunteers who, from many parts of the world, who took part in this research. And you can see from the database there, it actually grew through the project time. It grew from six sheets to however many there are shown there. And each of the lines that are in yellow are one of the 275 reports that were reported on. And these are what some of the reports look like. Really nicely put together. People really worked hard on this. All of these reports are now available as part of the free-to-view online Unpathed Waters project, which is bringing together a whole host of maritime collections from a wide range of sources. And if anybody's interested, if you'd like to view any of these reports, visit the Unpathed Waters website, which is quite simply there, unpathedwaters.org.uk. Look through the portal and search for the Welsh Wreck Web Research Project. Okay, so how does this project going to help with identifying the wreck of the Not the Diamond site? Well, one of the suggestions that we made to the researchers was that they might like to include in their reports a single page at a glance summary of the vessels they were investigating. Most people picked up on this idea and filled in a simple table of the vessel's main features and its backstory. These tables now provide us with the possibility of carrying out some simple interrogation of the differences between the vessels, both on the database and by not having to plough through 200 pages of report just to find the length of the vessel. So to give you an example of what I'm talking about here, about being able to interrogate this, is that from the underwater investigations of the designated site, and having dived it, we know that the wreck is likely to have been built around the mid-19th century, soon after they were cut down, the trees. It was probably a fully rigged ship, a bark or something similar. It was built of timber using oak, elm, larch and pine. So it was possibly built in Canada, because the Canadians often built in softwoods like that, as opposed to the Americans and the Brits, who built with almost entirely hardwoods. It was certainly strengthened using a lot of iron, and we know it was sheathed and fastened using Muntz metal. So we have these basic criteria that we're looking for from these at a glance pages. And by the end of the project, as I mentioned, that the number of vessels on the database had grown from 453 initially to 585. So you can see 10% of all the wrecks around the Welsh coast, of which 437 dated from the 19th century. And of these, 65 were fully rigged ships or barks or similar sized vessels. 25 of these are documented as having made contact with the reef, But of these, 3 were of steel construction, so we were able to write those off straight away. 13 were known to have refloated or salvaged severely, and 6 were either too small or built too early in the century, like the Diamond. So assuming we have the wreck that is on this site in our database, and we almost certainly will have, because this is a very large vessel. We might still have missed the odd small fishing vessel, but all the large vessels we're pretty confident are on our database. So for all of the 585 we started with, we're down to 3 potential candidates: the Pride of the Sea, the Kenilworth, and the Danube. So what we have is a Goldilocks scenario. Maybe one's too long, maybe one's broken up, and whatever. So we needed to investigate these in a bit more detail. So the Pride of the Sea is quite big. It's over 1,600 tons, built in 1853 in the US, in Baltimore, lost in 54 the following year. She ran onto the reef, was abandoned, caught fire, burnt for 48 hours before finally sinking in shallow water. So our thoughts on that are that 1,600 tons is pretty big. It's a bit large for the vessel that we think is on the site. We think it's closer to 1,000. There's no obvious signs of burnt timbers we've come across on the site, and some of the remains are thought to be visible of the Pride of the Sea in shallow waters on low spring tides, particularly on the southeast side of the reef, whereas the designated site is on the northwest side. The Kenilworth is a bit smaller, just over 1,200 tons, built in 55, also in the US, but in Maine, lost in 1870. This vessel ran onto the reef, but on the extreme southwestern end, about 8 or 9 miles offshore, and it's been reported to have been, at the time, to have broken up with large sections washing ashore on beach, particularly near Petwelly. So this wrecking took place around 6 or 7 miles further offshore than the designated site. The skeletal remains on the designated site appear to show the wreck intact, with no signs of it having broken up. And now finally, we've got the Danube, and this is just over 1,100 tons. So the smallest of the 3 we're looking at, built in 1854, and this was built in Canada, in Quebec, lost in 61, and noted to have run onto the reef about 5 miles offshore, so a bit further out than the designated site. But we know that from the time that after the storm abated and all the people on board had abandoned the vessel, there was a long salvaging operation carried out, that all the cargo was removed, after which the vessel floated free and eventually foundered in deeper water. So we also know that the Danube had Muntz metal sheathing, a lot of iron frames on board, was 52 meters long, and had on it oak, elm, pine, spruce, and larch. So if we go back to the chart of length against tonnage and compare these 3 new vessels with the Diamond, all of which we're looking for something in excess of 49 meters, the Pride comes in. We don't know the length of the Pride, but assuming it was right on our trend line, it must have been about 66 meters long. The Kenilworth is a bit smaller at 57 meters, and the Danube looks to be the most likely, just over 1,000 tons and 52 meters. It's and if we go back to look at all the other details that we know of those 3 vessels, we know that the Danube had the most typically timbers that relate to our site. It had a lot of iron on board. We don't know about the Pride or the Kenilworth, how much iron they had. The dates of build were all the same for all 3 ships virtually, so it could be in any of them, but only the Danube was built in Canada, which uses more likely to use the softwoods, and it's the one that we think is the most realistically closest to the shore once the Danube had refloated and then resunk. We know that the Danube had Muntz metal. The Danube is actually noted as being fitted with iron bolts, and we know we've got cuprous bolts. However, investigating a bit closer to Canadian vessels built in that period, they're noted that iron bolts are often used above the waterline and cuprous Muntz metal below. And as we're working right down by the turn of the bilge, this still does tie in probably with the Danube. We know the underwater site has got a couple of water tanks. They're not mentioned for any of those 3 vessels, but we know that the Pride was abandoned and burnt and sunk in shallow water. the Kenilworth ran aground, broke up and was lost, and that the Danube was salvaged and then refloated and foundered. So looking at all of those, the most likely is that the Danube would have been the one that is most likely to be the wreck on this designated site of those three. So here we are. We know that the site itself is 2.3 meters offshore, but we know that the Danube actually wrecked 5 miles out. Now, when it wrecked, most of the crew was rescued by the RNLI, or the lifeboats of the time, and that some of the crew managed to reach shore in their own small open boats, and obviously they wouldn't have fought against the wind and the tide, and finished up on shore right at the where the reef meets the shore. So our suggestion is that once the Danube had been salvaged and refloated, it is likely that it would have floated towards the shore, only to possibly founder on the site that we've been working and diving on. So the propositions from this this account is that the wreck on the designated site is not the diamond, but the Danube, and that the final resting place of the diamond is at the Wessex Archaeology's site number WA 7177. So here's a very poor quality of my very tired chart of the area. You can see the Taliban protected site there. And on the other side of the reef, on the north side, is the site that is the designated site, or the not the diamond site, that we think is probably the Danube. And the two crosses closer inshore of the two, we think that the one that's closest to a mile offshore is potentially going to be the diamond. So what's the future for this? Well, both these sites need to be dived and reviewed with fresh eyes to confirm or refute these propositions, these ideas. A fuller version of this presentation has been submitted to the IJNA for consideration possibly in a future version. It will have the similar title to this presentation, The Misidentification of a Shipwreck in Cardigan Bay, and it may be considered to be suitable for publication. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Ian, and perfect timing. You've left us 7 minutes or so for some questions. If you want to turn your camera on, and then people can see your lovely face and see that you're really with us.
Don't know about that.
Cool. If people do put questions that you might have to Ian in the chat or in the Q&A section, I'm going to kick things off. I might have a few for you, Ian. You mentioned right at the very beginning about the local divers who found it in summer of 2000, wasn't it?
Yep.
And some of the conversation today, and certainly in the project's sort of Q&A session we had earlier, was about getting people involved and about divers wanting things to do in the water. Did the finders continue their involvement, or did they literally dive it, find it, and then walk away?
They lived overlooking the site, overlooking the reef. So they've been diving the site for years, and continued diving the area, and had an interest in the site, and still do to today.
But did they become involved in your work, in your project?
It was quite a tricky site. The reason I'm not Welsh, and most of our team weren't Welsh, and we were brought in by CADU because of, for various reasons, to not favour any other particular local group.
Ooh, okay, politics.
So our first year of diving the site wasn't easy. We obviously didn't want to arrive mob-handed, coming in with the cavalry and taking over. It was very, very much an exercise on human relationships and getting to know people, and demonstrating that we weren't there to ride roughshod over anyone.
Indeed, yes, local politics. It's a question from Ray, and I kind of in terms of the designation, actually, because the diamond or not the diamond has been one of those ones that, in my mind, for some time knowing about it, I wondered why it was even designated in the first place. Maybe for its potential, or because there's not a great artifactually. There's not much.
No, I've tried to come to terms with why it was designated myself, and because several of the categories of that was looked at the time were associated with, if it was the diamond that was built in 1823, that, and it has so much iron on the site and on it, it would have been one of the earliest examples of composite wreck.
Yeah.
And that is the reason that it was designated. However, now proved that it's not the diamond, then it's debatable whether or not the site should remain designated.
Yeah, that's what Ray's got to the same sort of conclusion, I think, is that actually it's likely to then potentially invalidate its designation and maybe become de-designated. And de-designation does happen, can happen.
It does, yes.
Yeah, in fact, hasn't there been, I know Brighton Marina was de-designated. Is there a Welsh example of de-designation?
Not to my knowledge,
no.
No.
You've been congratulated on your great detective work. I certainly think there's an element of Sherlock Holmes in this, in terms of by the process of elimination, rule out the impossible, and anything that's left is the plausible. I got a question. You talked about the dating of the timbers, the dendrochronology, and you were talking about the softwood species being identified as from Canada, but not for the oak. Was the oak couldn't be provenanced?
Yes, the oak is from around the Great Lakes in North America, but because it originated from there, it could have been used either in Canadian boat building or American boat building, or even imported into the UK and used in British boat building at the time. So it's not conclusive from the provenance of the oak where it was built. And so I think it's the softwood, because typically American vessels of the period were built with hardwoods, as they were here in the UK, whereas the Canadian ones often, particularly around Quebec, were built in the softer woods.
Okay. Any questions from anyone else? I'm going to go for my last one then. Cadu presumably have been informed of your hopeful upcoming paper and the outcome of the research. Do you know, have they responded to interest in looking at 7177?
To my knowledge, not yet. But because that isn't a protected site in any way, anybody can go and dive that. And I would like to throw that out there to any dive groups that might be interested to contact me. I can give them the details and coordinates of it. Maybe they'd like to go and have a dive on it. It's obviously they need to abide by the normal regulations and of looking at sites and so on. But they may be able to get some information from that site to refute what I'm proposing here.
And do you know whether or not the original divers, the local divers that had overlooking the site, whether they've dived on 7177?
I don't know anybody who's dived that at the moment.
Okay, wow. Okay then, folks. Well, there's the challenge that's been extended by Ian. Anybody that wants to take on the ground truthing element of the anomaly on the seabed that was geophysical surveyed by Wessex in 2010, I think 2010. There you go. Get in contact with Ian either directly at Madhu or you can contact us and we'll put you in Ian's direction. Okay, Ian, thank you very much. That's brilliant. Well done.